Undercover CEO visits his restaurant. What he overhears from two boys leaves him shocked. Ethan Russo leaned back in the sleek leather chair of his corner office, staring at the framed photos of his restaurant, Russo's Table, that adorned the walls. The pictures captured moments of pride, smiling chefs in pristine whites, rows of diners basking in the warm glow of candlelight, and of course, Ethan himself, shaking hands with local food critics or slicing into a perfectly cooked roast. Russo's Table was his dream come to life, a place where food wasn't just nourishment but art. On paper, everything was perfect. The reviews online were stellar, filled with phrases like, "a dining experience unlike any other," and "a must-visit gem in the city." Sales were steady, and the restaurant was consistently booked. His staff seemed happy, or at least they acted like it when he passed through the kitchen or dining area. But Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. Despite the accolades, there was a distance between him and the soul of his restaurant. He used to know every detail, every regular customer, and every little quirk of the place. Now he only saw Russo's Table through spreadsheets, feedback reports, and carefully orchestrated PR campaigns. It felt less like the vibrant bistro he had once built, and more like a polished machine that ran without him. He rubbed his temples. "When did I lose touch with what really matters?" he murmured. Ethan had always been a hands-on leader, especially when things felt disconnected. Years ago, when he'd sensed morale slipping in the kitchen, he'd spent weeks working alongside his chefs, sweating over the stove and chopping vegetables. Another time, when customer feedback had flagged slow service, he donned a waiter's apron and worked the floor himself. This time, though, he wanted a different approach. He needed to see his restaurant through the eyes of his customers. That evening, Ethan dressed down in a plain hoodie, a pair of worn jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He even left his watch, a signature item, at home to avoid being recognized. As he stepped out of his car, the city's rain-slicked streets glistened under the amber streetlights. He pulled the hood tighter against the drizzle and walked toward Russo's Table. The restaurant glowed like a beacon on the quiet street, its large windows revealing the bustling life inside. Ethan paused at the door, watching through the glass as waiters weaved between tables, balancing trays laden with steaming plates of pasta and shimmering glasses of wine. Couples leaned in close, whispering over flickering candlelight, while families laughed and passed plates to one another. With a deep breath, Ethan pushed the door open, and the familiar hum of his restaurant enveloped him. The savory aroma of roasted garlic and fresh herbs greeted him like an old friend. No one gave him a second glance as he stepped inside, exactly what he wanted. Sliding into a booth near the back of the dining room, Ethan let his eyes wander. The brick walls, the dimly lit sconces, the delicate jazz playing in the background, it all felt alive. Yet there was a part of him that remained detached, as though he were a stranger visiting for the first time. A cheerful waitress approached his table, her notepad in hand, and her smile warm but practiced. "Good evening. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Ethan kept his voice casual, glancing briefly at the menu. "Just water for now, and I'll need a few minutes to decide on the food." "Of course, take your time," she replied before disappearing into the throng of tables. Ethan opened the menu he knew by heart, but barely glanced at the words. Instead, he let his ears tune in to the chatter around him. His goal tonight wasn't to enjoy a meal, but to listen, to hear what his customers thought of the place. Honest, unfiltered opinions. As he sat there soaking in the atmosphere, a faint conversation from the booth behind him caught his attention. The voices were hushed, but there was an edge to them that made Ethan's ears perk up. "Do you think we'll even see him?" one boy whispered, his voice high and uncertain. "Mom said he comes here all the time," another voice replied, sharper and more confident. Ethan froze, his menu held stiffly in his hands. Who were they talking about, he wondered, his heartbeat quickening. He resisted the urge to turn around and instead strained to hear more. "What if we get caught?" the first voice asked nervously. "We won't," the second voice snapped. "We just have to wait." Ethan's brow furrowed as unease crept in. The way they whispered carried a tension that made him sit up straighter. Who were they looking for? And why did it feel like their words were directed at him? He forced himself to stay calm, but his mind was already racing. This was supposed to be a quiet evening of observation, a chance to reconnect with his business. Yet here he was, suddenly drawn into something far more intriguing and possibly troubling. Ethan sat rigidly in his booth, his menu open but forgotten as the conversation behind him intensified. The two boys' voices, though hushed, cut through the din of the bustling restaurant. Their words carried an urgency that Ethan couldn't ignore. He leaned back slightly, careful not to draw attention to himself, and strained to hear. "Mom said it's his fault," the first boy murmured. His voice trembled, as though saying the words out loud made them heavier. "She told us he ruined everything," the second boy replied sharply, his tone dripping with bitterness. Ethan's stomach knotted. His fault? What could they possibly mean? He instinctively gripped the edge of the table, his mind scrambling for answers. He'd had his share of tough business decisions over the years, layoffs, supplier disputes, even a few firings. But nothing he could recall seemed severe enough to elicit this level of anger and pain. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts as the waitress returned with his water. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, her cheerful tone pulling him back to the present. Ethan glanced down at the menu, barely registering the words. He nodded quickly. The house special, please." "Great choice," she chirped, jotting it down before whisking away. Ethan exhaled, glad for her swift departure. He needed to focus. The boys' voices drifted back to him. "We shouldn't even be here," the first boy whispered nervously. "What if someone recognizes us?" "No one's going to recognize us," the second boy snapped. "Mom said he wouldn't hide. If he's here, we'll know." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a direct challenge, a jab at some hidden truth he wasn't yet privy to. The boys were clearly searching for someone, and their words were starting to feel dangerously close to home. He shifted in his seat, careful not to turn around but desperate to catch more of their conversation. Were they looking for him? And if so, why? Who was their mother, and what had he supposedly done to her? The younger boy's voice broke the silence again, his tone softer this time. "What if he doesn't care?" The older boy scoffed. "Of course he doesn't care. People like him never do. That's why we're here. Mom said we need to see him. I need to see him." Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken about like this, even indirectly. People admired him, respected him. He had built Russo's table on the principles of hard work and creativity. Yet here were these two boys, painting a picture of someone cold and ruthless, a man Ethan didn't recognize in himself. He replayed their words in his mind. Mom said he ruined her life. He took everything from her. It's all his fault. Each phrase hit harder than the last, leaving a growing sense of guilt and confusion. For a moment, Ethan considered dismissing the whole thing. Maybe this was a misunderstanding, or perhaps the boys were mistaking him for someone else. But their voices carried a conviction that made it hard to ignore. And as much as he wanted to walk away from whatever storm was brewing, he knew he couldn't. Not until he knew the truth. He took a sip of his water, trying to steady his nerves, and cast a quick glance at the booth behind him. The boys were young, no older than 13 or 14. One had a mop of messy curls sticking out from under his hoodie, while the other wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. They both looked anxious, their eyes darting around the room as though they expected to be thrown out at any moment. Ethan's thoughts raced. Could he have unknowingly hurt someone so badly that her children were here, in his restaurant, seeking him out? He prided himself on running his business with integrity, but the weight of their accusations gnawed at the edges of his conscience. What if there was truth in their words? Mom said he stole everything from her, the older boy muttered, his voice dropping lower but still audible to Ethan. That's why she had to leave. That's why we don't have anything now. Ethan froze. Stole? Leave? The words conjured fragments of memories, faces, moments, decisions, but nothing clear. His mind sifted through years of staff changes, disagreements, and promotions, but he couldn't pinpoint anything that matched this level of bitterness. His pulse quickened. He needed answers, but how could he approach them without escalating the situation? Confronting them outright might make things worse, especially if their anger was directed at him. But sitting in silence, pretending not to hear, felt just as wrong. He had to make a decision. Ethan couldn't sit still any longer. The weight of the boys' whispered accusations pressed heavily on his chest, demanding answers. He took a deep breath, glancing at the booth behind him once more. The boys were leaning close, their expressions intense as they continued their quiet discussion. Every instinct in Ethan screamed at him to stay put, but curiosity and guilt had a stronger pull. Carefully he stood up, smoothing down his hoodie to keep his movements casual. He grabbed his glass of water and approached the boys' booth, feigning a relaxed demeanor. Their conversation halted the moment they noticed him approaching. The younger boy, with his curly hair peeking out from under his hoodie, froze mid-sentence, his wide eyes darting to his companion. The older boy, the one with the baseball cap, stiffened, his shoulders squaring defensively. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice sharp and laced with suspicion. Ethan raised his hands slightly, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "Hey, I'm sorry if I startled you," he said, keeping his tone gentle. "I couldn't help but overhear you talking. It sounded like you might be looking for someone. I thought maybe I could help." The younger boy shot a nervous glance at his brother, who glared back at Ethan with a mix of distrust and defiance. "Why would you want to help us?" the older boy asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "You just seem like you're here for something important. And if I can help, I'd like to." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then the older boy narrowed his eyes, studying Ethan's face closely. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, anger. His lips parted as realization dawned. "Wait," the boy said slowly, his voice rising slightly. I've seen you before. You're him, aren't you? You're Ethan Russo." Ethan's heart sank, though he kept his expression neutral. "I am," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand why that matters." The boy's glare hardened. "Of course you don't," he spat. "You don't even remember, do you? You don't remember what you did to our mom." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the accusation. "Your mom?" he asked, his voice faltering. "I'm sorry, I don't think I know her. Who is she?" The younger boy, who had been quiet until now, spoke up, his voice shaking with emotion. "Her name's Sophie Martin. She used to work for you." The name hit Ethan like a bolt of lightning. Sophie Martin. A flash of memory surfaced. A talented young sous chef who had worked at Russo's table years ago. She'd been ambitious, full of creative energy, but she had left abruptly, without explanation. Ethan had barely given it a second thought at the time, chalking it up to the natural turnover in the restaurant business. "Sophie," he said slowly, the name heavy on his tongue. "I remember her. She was a great chef, but I don't understand. What did I do to her?" The older boy's hands curled into fists on the table. "You stole from her," he said, his voice trembling with fury. "You took her recipes, claimed them as your own, and made sure she couldn't get a job anywhere else. You ruined her career." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "That's not true," he said, though his voice wavered. "I would never do something like that." "Then why did she have to leave?" the younger boy demanded. "Why did every restaurant turn her away after she left yours? She told us it was because of you." Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of that time. He remembered Sophie's creativity in the kitchen, her bold ideas that often pushed the boundaries of their menu. But could he have inadvertently overshadowed her contributions? Had his ambition left her in the shadows? The thought sent a chill down his spine. "I didn't know," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't know she felt that way." The older boy's glare didn't waver. "You didn't care," he snapped. "People like you never do. You took everything from her and didn't even notice." Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The anger in the boy's voice was palpable, and he knew that no explanation he could offer would ease their pain. But he also knew he couldn't leave things like this. "I need to talk to her," he said firmly, meeting the boy's eyes. "I need to hear her side of the story. If what you're saying is true, I need to make it right." The boys exchanged a wary glance. Finally, the older one spoke. "She's not here right now," he said. "But if you really want to know the truth, you'll have to come to us." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. "Tell me where, and I'll be there." The rain had eased into a light drizzle by the time Ethan arrived at the address the boys had given him. The modest apartment building stood in stark contrast to the sleek, upscale world he was used to. Its faded paint and cracked sidewalks were a sharp reminder of how different Sophie Martin's life had turned out compared to his own. Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he climbed the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. Each step brought a new wave of questions. What if they're right? What if I did ruin her life? He shook his head, trying to focus. This wasn't about his guilt. It was about getting answers. At the top of the stairs, a door creaked open, and Jacob, the older boy, appeared. His expression was a mixture of surprise and guarded distrust. "You came," Jacob said, his voice flat, as though he hadn't expected Ethan to actually show up. Ethan nodded. "I need to understand what happened. Where's your mom?" Jacob hesitated, then stepped aside. "She's in the living room, but don't expect her to be happy to see you." Ethan stepped into the apartment, his heart pounding. The space was small but tidy, with well-worn furniture and family photos lining the walls. It was clear that Sophie had done her best to create a warm home for her boys, even in difficult circumstances. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, a small comfort in the otherwise heavy atmosphere. Sophie sat on the couch, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the television. Her auburn hair, once vibrant, was streaked with gray, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that hadn't been there all those years ago. But despite the years and the weariness etched on her face, she was still unmistakably Sophie, the ambitious, passionate chef Ethan had once admired. She looked up as Ethan entered, her expression flickering between shock and resentment. For a moment the room was silent, the weight of unspoken history hanging thick in the air. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "Ethan Russo," she said, her tone cold. "I can't say I ever expected to see you here." Ethan took a cautious step forward. "Sophie, She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. If you're here to justify what you did, don't bother. I've heard enough excuses in my lifetime." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I'm not here to justify anything," he said, his voice quieter now. "I came because I didn't know. The boys told me what you said, and if it's true, I need to hear it from you. I need to understand." Sophie leaned back on the couch, crossing her arms over her chest. "You don't understand," she asked bitterly. "Of course you don't. People like you never do. You take, and then you move on, never looking back at the mess you leave behind." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Sophie, I swear, I never meant to hurt you. But if I did, please, tell me what I did." She studied him for a long moment, her sharp gaze searching his face as if trying to determine whether his remorse was genuine. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders sagging under the weight of old memories. "You want the short version?" she said, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "Fine. You stole from me, Ethan. All those signature dishes that made Russo's table famous, most of them were mine. You took my ideas, my recipes, and passed them off as your own. And when I confronted you about it, you made sure I couldn't get a job anywhere else. Do you know how many restaurants turned me away? I had to leave the industry entirely." Ethan's heart sank as her words hit him like a tidal wave. He searched his memory, piecing together fragments from those early years. Sophie had always been bold in the kitchen, experimenting with flavors and techniques. But had he truly taken credit for her work? And the blacklisting? Had he unknowingly contributed to that? He'd never intentionally sabotaged anyone, but could his ambition have blinded him to her struggles? "Sophie, I didn't know," he said quietly. "If what you're saying is true, I swear to you, I didn't realize. I thought I was mentoring you, helping you grow." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Mentoring me? Is that what you tell yourself? Do you even remember how I left, Ethan? Do you remember the argument we had in your office?" Ethan froze, the memory bubbling to the surface. He did remember, a heated conversation about recognition, about whose name should be attached to the menu. He'd brushed off her concerns, focused on the bigger picture of growing the restaurant. "I thought we were building something together," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "But you were only ever building something for yourself." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on Ethan like a stone. He looked at the family photos on the wall, at the evidence of a life that had been forced to take a different path because of his actions or his neglect. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. "I can't change what happened, Sophie. I can't undo the mistakes I made, but I can try to make it right, if you'll let me." Sophie's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. "And how do you plan to do that?" Ethan straightened, determination sparking in his chest. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. And I promise you I won't stop until I've done everything I can to make things right. For you, for your boys, for everything you've been through." Sophie stared at him for a long moment before turning her gaze to the television, her posture stiff. "It's too late to fix what's broken, Ethan," she said softly. "But I'll hear what you have to say." For years he had prided himself on building Russo's table into the success it was today. But tonight, he realized that his ambition had come at a cost he had never acknowledged. The realization cut deeper than he expected. He knew now that he couldn't walk away. He owed Sophie more than an apology. He owed her an effort to make things right. Back in his office at the restaurant the next morning, Ethan stared at the blank notepad in front of him. The phrase Sophie had used kept repeating in his mind, "You stole from me." He didn't think of himself as a thief, but he couldn't deny the truth in her accusation. Her recipes, her ideas, and her contributions had been instrumental in shaping the restaurant's success. Yet, over time, her name had faded into the background while his became synonymous with Russo's table. He tapped his pen against the desk, thinking about how to start repairing the damage. "I can't change the past," he muttered to himself, "but I can own up to it. I can give her the recognition she deserves." Ethan picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he landed on a familiar name. David Klein, a respected food critic and an old industry friend. David had always admired Sophie's work during her time at Russo's table. When David answered, his tone was warm but curious. "Ethan Russo, haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on?" Ethan took a deep breath. "David, I need your help. Do you remember Sophie Martin?" David's pause was brief but telling. "Of course I do. She was one of the most promising chefs I've ever seen. Why? What happened to her?" "I happened to her," Ethan admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I made mistakes, big ones. And now I want to make it right. But I need your help to tell her story, to make sure the industry knows how talented she is." David's voice softened. "Well, that's a start, Ethan. If you're serious about this, the first thing you need to do is shine a spotlight on her contributions. People need to know what she's capable of." Ethan nodded, already scribbling notes. "That's exactly what I was thinking. Thank you, David." The plan takes shape. Over the next several days, Ethan threw himself into action. He began drafting a press release to acknowledge Sophie's contributions to Russo's table publicly. He reached out to food critics, journalists, and bloggers, offering them an inside look at Sophie's story and her pivotal role in shaping the restaurant's success. He emphasized her creativity, her innovative dishes, and the passion she had brought to the team. At the same time, Ethan worked with his restaurant's management team to create a new position for Sophie, co-head chef, with full creative control and equal recognition. It was more than a job. It was a chance for her to reclaim her career and her voice. To show her how serious he was, Ethan also began organizing an industry dinner at Russo's table, a showcase event where Sophie could present her own creations and remind everyone why she had once been considered a rising star in the culinary world. An uncertain response. Finally, Ethan picked up the phone and called Sophie. His heart pounded as the line rang, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. But then her voice came through, guarded and cool. "What do you want, Ethan?" He cleared his throat. "Sophie, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I took credit for your work and how that affected your life. I can't undo what happened, but I want to try to make it right." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Sophie said, "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Ethan explained his plans, the press release, the co-head chef position, the industry dinner. He told her about the steps he was taking to ensure her name was finally recognized for the contributions she had made. When he finished, the silence on the line was deafening. Ethan waited, unsure of how she would respond. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice tinged with skepticism. You think offering me a job and some public acknowledgement will fix everything? No, Ethan said firmly. This isn't about fixing everything. It's about giving you the credit and the opportunity you should have had from the start. I don't expect forgiveness, Sophie. I just want to give you the chance to step back into the career you love, on your terms. Sophie sighed. I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan. It's been years and I've built my life around not needing this industry anymore. Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I understand. And I know this won't be easy. But I hope you'll at least think about it. Take your time, Sophie. The door will always be open. There was another pause, and then Sophie said quietly, I'll think about it. As Ethan hung up, he felt a mix of relief and lingering guilt. Sophie's hesitance was understandable, but the fact that she was willing to consider his offer gave him hope. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. The air in Russo's table felt heavier than usual that evening. Ethan paced the empty dining room, his eyes darting toward the front door every few moments. The restaurant was quiet, the staff having cleared out early to give him privacy for the meeting. He had sent Sophie a formal invitation to come see what he had planned, along with the press release he had written to acknowledge her contributions to the restaurant's success. He hadn't heard back. Now, standing alone in the dimly lit space, Ethan wrestled with the uncertainty of her decision. Would she come? And if she did, would she even consider his offer? The door creaked open, and Ethan's heart leapt. Sophie stepped inside, her boys, Jacob and Liam, trailing a few steps behind her. She wore a simple coat, her posture guarded, her eyes scanning the room as though bracing herself for a confrontation. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and forced a smile. Sophie, he said, stepping forward, thank you for coming. She nodded stiffly. Jacob and Liam convinced me to hear you out. Jacob crossed his arms and gave Ethan a pointed look. We're watching you, he muttered. Ethan chuckled softly, appreciating the boy's protective nature. That's fair. I wouldn't expect anything less. Ethan led Sophie and her sons into the kitchen, where he had laid everything out carefully. Printed drafts of the press release, a folder detailing the proposed position, and even a mock menu showcasing some of Sophie's signature recipes alongside new ideas they could collaborate on. This, Ethan began, gesturing to the materials, is what I've been working on. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to start by acknowledging everything you did to make Russo's table what it is today. Sophie picked up the press release, her eyes scanning the words. Ethan had written about her creativity, her vision, and how her ideas had shaped the restaurant's identity. He had credited her with several of the dishes that had become crowd favorites, something he admitted he should have done years ago. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. You really put my name in here? Ethan nodded. Of course. It's where it should have been all along. He opened the folder and slid it across the counter toward her. This is the proposal I mentioned, a co-head chef position. Full creative control. Your name will go on every dish you create, and your voice will be as important as mine when it comes to running the kitchen. Sophie glanced at the documents but didn't reach for them. Instead, she looked at Ethan, her expression unreadable. And what do you expect to get out of this? Redemption? Forgiveness? Ethan shook his head. No, he said firmly. This isn't about me. This is about giving you what you should have had from the start. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sophie. I just want to make sure the world sees you for the incredible chef you are. For the first time, Sophie's expression softened, just slightly. She ran her fingers over the edge of the folder, her thoughts clearly racing. Jacob, who had been watching silently, finally spoke up. How do we know you're serious? How do we know this isn't just about making yourself look good? Ethan turned to face him, his voice steady. You don't. Not yet. All I can do is show you through my actions. And if that means starting small and earning your trust over time, then that's what I'll do. Sophie's younger son, Liam, piped up timidly. Mom, do you think you'll do it? Go back to cooking? Sophie looked at her boys, the weight of their question reflected in her eyes. She had spent so many years keeping her distance from the industry, convincing herself she didn't need it. But now, standing in the very kitchen she had once dreamed of running, she couldn't ignore the flicker of longing stirring inside her. After a long silence, Sophie exhaled deeply and looked at Ethan. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him like a wave. "That's all I'm asking. Take your time, Sophie. The offer will always be here." Sophie hesitated, then extended her hand. Ethan shook it, his grip firm but gentle. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for even considering this." Before she left, Ethan offered to show her around the restaurant. Sophie agreed, her boys trailing behind as Ethan led her through the dining area, the wine room, and finally back to the kitchen. As they walked, Sophie noticed small changes Ethan had made over the years, some good, some not so much. But when they reached the wall near the kitchen's entrance, her breath caught. Ethan had hung a framed collage of old photos, including one of Sophie at work during her time at Russo's table. "I wanted to remind everyone where we started," Ethan said softly, noticing her reaction. "You were a huge part of that." Sophie ran her fingers over the edge of the frame, her expression distant. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she murmured. As the tour came to an end, Sophie turned to Ethan. "If I decide to do this, I'm not just going to forget everything that happened." Ethan nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to, but I'm willing to work to earn your trust, however long it takes." Sophie studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see." Sophie stood at the entrance of Russo's table, her hands clutching the strap of her bag as she took a deep breath. It had been years since she had last stepped foot into this place, and the memories came rushing back, both the pride she had felt when she worked here and the bitterness that had followed her departure. Today, though, she wasn't here to dwell on the past. She was here to test Ethan Russo's sincerity. Inside, the kitchen hummed with activity as the team prepared for the dinner rush. Ethan had cleared the day's schedule so Sophie could reacquaint herself with the space and meet the current staff. When Sophie walked in, the clatter of pots and pans seemed to pause, and all eyes turned to her. Ethan emerged from his office, wiping his hands on a towel. He smiled, but there was an edge of nervousness in his expression. "Sophie," he greeted her warmly, extending a hand. "Welcome back." Sophie hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she said. "I'm just here to see if this is even worth considering." Ethan nodded, his tone earnest. "Fair enough. Let me show you around." Ethan guided Sophie through the kitchen, introducing her to the staff. Some were familiar faces, longtime employees who lit up when they saw her, but many were new. As they moved through the space, Ethan made sure to highlight the changes he had made over the years. New equipment, reorganized workstations, and an emphasis on collaboration among the team. At first, Sophie kept her distance, nodding politely but saying little. But as she observed the team at work, her instincts began to kick in. She stepped closer to one of the chefs who was preparing a sauce, eyeing the consistency with a critical gaze. "You need to let that reduce a little longer," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. The chef hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who nodded in encouragement. "She's right," Ethan said. "Sophie's got an eye for these things." Gradually, Sophie found herself engaging more with the team. She offered tips on plating, suggested adjustments to seasoning, and even rolled up her sleeves to demonstrate a technique for one of the junior chefs. The energy in the kitchen shifted, becoming livelier and more dynamic. It was as though Sophie had brought a spark with her that the team hadn't realized they were missing. After a couple of hours, Ethan approached Sophie with an idea. "How about we create something new together? A dish that represents both of us." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You want to collaborate, after everything?" Ethan smiled sheepishly. "I figure it's the best way to prove I'm serious about this. Besides, you've always had a knack for bold flavors. I'd love to see what we can come up with." Reluctantly, Sophie agreed. They gathered ingredients and began brainstorming, each offering ideas and pushing back on the other's suggestions. At first, the process was tense. Sophie was still guarded, and Ethan was overly cautious. But as they worked, the walls between them began to lower. They debated flavors, textures, and plating styles, laughing occasionally when an idea didn't work out. Finally, they settled on a dish, a rich aromatic pasta with a citrus-infused cream sauce and charred vegetables. It was bold yet refined, a perfect blend of Sophie's daring creativity and Ethan's polished techniques. When the dish was finished, they plated it and presented it to the staff. The team gathered around, eager to taste the result of their collaboration. As the chefs took their first bites, the room erupted in murmurs of approval. "This is incredible," one of the sous chefs said. "You two make a great team." Sophie glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small, genuine smile. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. That evening, Jacob and Liam arrived at the restaurant to check in on their mother. They were still wary of Ethan, but their curiosity outweighed their hostility. Sophie introduced them to some of the staff and showed them around the kitchen, where the boys marveled at the bustling environment. Ethan approached them cautiously, keeping his tone light. "Hey, Jacob, Liam, what do you think so far?" Jacob crossed his arms. "It's fine, I guess. But this doesn't change anything." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "I wouldn't expect it to. Trust takes time, and I'm willing to earn it." Liam, the younger of the two, looked up at his mother. "Are you happy, Mom?" Sophie hesitated, then smiled softly. "I think I could be. It feels good to be back in a kitchen." Jacob studied Ethan for a moment before speaking. "If you mess this up, we're gone. Got it?" Ethan held his gaze and nodded. "Got it." Over the next several weeks, Sophie's presence in the kitchen became a fixture. She and Ethan continued to collaborate on new dishes, blending their styles and creating a menu that reflected both of their strengths. The restaurant thrived under their partnership, with customers and critics praising the innovative new direction. As Sophie regained her confidence, the tension between her and Ethan began to ease. They worked side by side, their shared passion for food slowly mending the fractures in their relationship. The staff, inspired by their example, worked harder than ever, and Russo's table began to feel like the vibrant, creative space it had once been. Jacob and Liam started visiting more often, their initial distrust gradually giving way to curiosity and eventually pride. One evening, as the boys sat at a table near the kitchen, Ethan brought out a plate of the pasta dish he and Sophie had created together. "Here," he said, placing it in front of them. "This is something your mom and I made. Let me know what you think." The boys exchanged a glance before digging in. After a few bites, Jacob looked up at Ethan. "It's good," he admitted grudgingly. "But you still have a long way to go." Ethan chuckled. "Fair enough." Months had passed since Sophie Martin had returned to Russo's table, and the transformation within the restaurant was undeniable. The energy in the kitchen buzzed with excitement and creativity as Sophie and Ethan led the team side by side. The staff had grown accustomed to their dynamic partnership, and the collaborative spirit they fostered had pushed the restaurant to new heights. Ethan stood at the pass one busy evening, watching dishes go out to the packed dining room. Each plate carried not just food but a story, a blend of his precision and Sophie's bold creativity. For the first time in years, Russo's table felt alive in a way it hadn't before, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Not in himself, but in the people who had made it possible. Critics and regulars alike raved about the new menu. One particular review had stood out to Ethan. "Russo's table has not only reclaimed its place as a culinary gem, but has risen to greater heights under the joint leadership of Ethan Russo and Sophie Martin. Their ability to blend styles, ideas, and creativity has resulted in a dining experience that is truly unparalleled." The words had moved him more than he expected. This wasn't just his success, it was theirs. Sophie, meanwhile, had begun to rediscover her love for the industry. The passion that had once burned so brightly was back, stronger and steadier than before. She no longer doubted her place in the kitchen or her ability to lead. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. Jacob and Liam had become regular visitors to the restaurant, often sitting at a table near the kitchen where they could watch their mother at work. At first, their visits had been about keeping an eye on Ethan, but as the weeks turned into months, their distrust began to soften. One evening, as Sophie prepped for the dinner service, Jacob wandered into the kitchen. He stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "You're really happy here, aren't you?" he asked. Sophie paused, turning to face her son. There was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "I am," she said simply. "It feels good to be doing what I love again." Jacob nodded, his gaze drifting to Ethan, who was busy giving instructions to the staff. "He's not as bad as I thought," Jacob admitted reluctantly. Sophie chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He's trying, Jacob. That's all we can ask for." One rainy evening after the dinner rush had settled, Sophie found Ethan sitting alone in his office, going over financial reports. She knocked lightly on the doorframe, and he looked up, surprised. "Sophie," he said, setting the papers aside. "What's up?" She stepped into the room, her arms crossed, but her posture less guarded than before. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for everything you've done these past few months. I didn't think it was possible, but you've proven me wrong." Ethan smiled, his gratitude evident. "I didn't do this for me. I did it for you and your boys." Sophie hesitated, then extended her hand. "Well, whatever your reasons, I appreciate it. Here's to starting fresh." Ethan shook her hand firmly. "Here's to a new chapter." To mark Sophie's official return and the restaurant's newfound success, Ethan organized a special event, a chef's dinner, featuring the dishes she and the team had created over the past few months. Invitations were sent to food critics, loyal patrons, and even industry leaders who had once overlooked Sophie's talent. The night of the event, Russo's table was buzzing with excitement. Sophie stood in the kitchen overseeing the plating of the first course. Her boys were seated at a table in the front row, beaming with pride as they watched their mother command the kitchen. Ethan stepped up beside her, holding 2 champagne flutes. "You ready for this?" he asked, handing her one. Sophie smirked. "I was born ready." The dinner was a resounding success. Each dish was met with applause, and by the end of the night, Sophie received a standing ovation from the guests. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she looked out at the room, at her sons, the staff, and even Ethan. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. The next day, as the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, Sophie found herself lingering near the framed collage of photos Ethan had put up months ago. She traced her fingers over the glass, pausing on a picture of her younger self, standing in the very kitchen she now commanded. Ethan approached quietly, his voice gentle. "It's good to have you back, Sophie." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "It's good to be back. But don't think I've forgotten everything that happened." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I wouldn't expect you to, but I'll keep working to earn your trust every single day." Sophie smiled faintly. "You're on the right track." As the weeks turned into months, Russo's table thrived under their joint leadership. The collaboration between Ethan and Sophie became the restaurant's defining story, a tale of redemption, resilience, and the power of second chances. One evening, as the restaurant bustled with activity, Jacob and Liam approached Ethan near the pass. Jacob hesitated before speaking. "You did good," he said gruffly. "Mom's happy. That's all that matters." Ethan grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." Liam added quietly, "We're proud of her, and maybe of you too." Ethan's chest tightened with emotion. "Thanks, boys. That means more than you know." The chapter ends with Ethan watching Sophie work in the kitchen, her movements confident and precise. Jacob and Liam laughed together at a nearby table, the joy in their voices filling the room. For the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace, not because he had redeemed himself, but because he had found a way to lift others up. As the restaurant's doors closed for the night, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing through it, and creating something better in its wake. And as Sophie caught his eye and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, Ethan knew the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more stories of bravery, inspiration, and the human spirit.